The college basketball portal window opened on Monday, but it's quiet on the home front. Nothing going on in Manhattan. No news is good news right now, but how long will that last?
You are Locked On Kansas State, your daily podcast on the Kansas State Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on into Locked On Kansas State, your daily Kansas State Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Christian Rauh, and thank you so much for making Locked On Kansas State your first listen every single day. Welcome back to my everydayers. We have a great episode for you today. First, before we get to that, I'd like to thank you for getting us over the 700 subscriber mark. We are cooking. We are very close already to 800 subscribers. So if you haven't already, do me a favor, click that subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment as well. Had a nice conversation with a couple of you in our last video talking about the Iowa head coaching position with Bennett Sturts, who unfortunately will not be a Kansas State Wildcat. I had a good time having that conversation with you in the comment description. So be sure to leave a comment, leave a question, all that good stuff. I really thank you for that. On this show, we are talking the transfer portal. We are talking men's basketball. And like Bennett Sturts, no news there. He is going to be an Iowa Hawkeye. But for the rest of the Kansas State squad, there is also really no news. No news is good news, I guess, in this type of moment. I'm surprised that we haven't had anything go down. We're actually quite shocked, to be honest with you. But I think it's a good thing. Scratch that. I know it's a good thing. Now, I don't think that we are going to be without news for this entire portal window. I think we are eventually going to get some things coming down the pipeline, and we'll get to that in just a moment, what we're getting from chatter. But as of right now, the only thing that has Kansas State in any type of hearings or rumblings is with a few reaching out to a few players that are in the portal themselves. But as for the current Kansas State roster, the only things that we know is that there will be two players not returning to the roster next season. And we've already known that. Coleman Hawkins and David Gasson. And it's not because they're entering the portal, it's because they're out of eligibility. But other than that, as of right now, as we stand today, heading into Thursday, which is a wild game, wild Thursday, by the way, loaded with sports. Sweet 16 starts, MLB opening day. Hope you have a great time after you listen to this. And I thank you for first listen today. I hope you have a great time enjoying sports today. But other than that, what's going to happen to this Kansas State roster? It's a great thing that it wasn't an immediate jump for some of these players. As soon as that portal opened, we saw 5 Kansas State names. I think that could have been a problem. I think that could have been an issue for what Jerome Tang is trying to build. We've talked about it a few times on this show throughout the season, but it's worth mentioning again as we sit in the scenario that Jerome Tang is trying to build. Last season, they completely went from nuts and bolts with the exception of really David Gasson and brought in a whole new team and then expected this team to perform. And I know NIL comes into play with that, and it's going to come into play even more in the future, especially with this new revenue sharing process. But they figured out that they have to build a core at some point in time. At least they want to. And he kept referencing, Jerome Tang kept referencing that he wanted to mimic the Houston's model. Now, Houston is still playing. They're going to be playing this weekend for a chance to go to the Elite Eight. So what they're doing is working. They're a number 1 seed for a reason in this tournament. They won the Big 12 for a reason, because they continue to dominate their type of way. And their type of way in the eyes of the portal and recruiting and just building their roster is based around retention. They continue to bring back so many players with, I believe it was like, I don't even remember the numbers that Coach Tang said, but he talked about how the majority of the starter minutes or the minutes played or points production from that team would return, would not enter or leave via the portal. The only players that they would lose were if they lost eligibility or entered the NBA draft. That's a great problem to have. That means the culture is fantastic for Kelvin Sampson and for that Houston basketball program. Why would you want to leave if you have it, probably the best right now. Now, some players go and chase a bag, understandably so. In this day and age, you don't know what's going to happen past the next year, especially in a basketball type world, where we're going to talk women's basketball here on another episode later on this week before we get to Saturday. But one of the main opponents that Kansas State women's have to play, Juju Hawkins, just injured her ACL and is probably going to be out for not only the rest of this season, but the majority, if not all, of next year. Now, you don't know what's going to happen next. So I don't blame players for going for NIL. I don't. Not one bit. Because there are thousands of players in college basketball. Only 60 get drafted to the NBA every year. And you have to fight with international players there too. It's not just college players. You're lucky if 40, 45 of those 60 are coming from NCAA colleges. And then you have the G League as well that gets drafted. I mean, 40 is probably actually too much these days. So I'm all for NIL. So I'm not going to take that away. But what Kansas State is doing here, I want to take that, kind of reform this conversation here. If what they have done so far, the fact that we have not seen anyone enter the transfer portal, although we will, and we'll get to that here shortly, it looks like Jerome Tang is well on his way to building that core to create that nice, hopefully, retention and start mimicking the Houston model. It'd be nice if I could stop saying the Houston model, and in a year's time, I could start calling it the Kansas State model. Because the last 2 years have been dreadful. I mean, there's no better word to say than they've been dreadful. After an Elite Eight, you go and you miss the tournament 2 years in a row. You basically have brand new roster each time. And you don't have any type of, well, last year you had all this hope, but I think we learned after this past season that it is very difficult to build a team, to build a culture, to build a buy-in with a team that has no idea how to play together until they're in the middle of the season and it's already too late. Your non-conference is over, your resume looks terrible, and you're battling an uphill battle where there's ice on the hill. So you got to find a way to build that core, to build that relationship in the off season. And I think this is exactly what's going to happen with Kansas State this year, as long as we don't have a crazy exodus in the transfer portal. So far, so good. Now, can that change? Absolutely. And it can change on a moment's notice. I can hit stop on this podcast. I could publish it for you folks to listen to and enjoy. And 20 minutes later, we could see someone enter the transfer portal. That's quite possible. But what I'm getting at is that you got to have a little bit of faith here. That after the season that Kansas State had, a disappointing season, an underwhelming season, an underperforming season, whatever word or term you want to use, in this case, I think those three fit pretty well. And I don't think I'm being a harsh critic when I'm saying those three terms. You would have expected that some players would have ran to the portal as fast as they possibly could as soon as it hit on Monday. We are already well aware that Kansas State wasn't playing postseason basketball by that time. And there is no reason for anyone to stick around, at least for what we know, instead of hitting the portal. You want to get in there as fast as you can so you can open your options. So coaches call you or contact you or your agent. The fact that they're not in there yet leaves me a lot of hope that Coach Tang and his coaching staff are trying to build that culture and focus on just building a few more pieces to fill the spots of Coleman Hawkins, David Gasson, and those extra little scholarship pieces, because now you get 15 scholarships heading into this year. Just building on those, making it more of a retool other than a rebuild. And although that retool needs to be pretty aggressive because they haven't made the NCAA tournament in 2 seasons, it is still possible to make great advancements. So I'm personally excited the fact that nothing has happened to the portal. I want most of these players back. As I mentioned, I do think that there are going to be a few players that enter the transfer portal. It will not surprise me when a couple of those names do hit. Now, there is some rumors going around about a couple other players that are possibly going to hit the portal, and some might actually surprise me, which we'll get to in just a second. Because if some of those names do pop up, it's going to be kind of unfortunate. But overall, I think from what we're hearing from the rumblings, Jerome Tang and his coaching staff are building a culture. Roster continuity is an important thing in college basketball. I don't believe in the one and done rule. It works for some schools, some elite schools, if you will. It works for like Duke. And really, that's it. Duke kind of like completely shifted their focus on that. But it doesn't work for every school. And I don't think it works for the Big 12. And although ACC and Big 12 kind of can go hand in hand, like when you look at the Power Four conferences, in terms of basketball, I mean, Duke's at a different level right now. They really are. That's just how it is. That's why those kind of recruits can go there, play 1 year, enter the NBA draft. Do you really want that, though? I mean, yes, I'd take a Cooper Flag, but do you want to always have to worry about getting a unproven freshman every year, hoping that it pans out? And if it does, great. But if not, you're in the same situation. And then your fans once again are saying, well, we trusted a freshman. We spent millions of dollars on a freshman. Or instead, you can say, well, I know what we have with this team. If we just add one or two more pieces, if we just tinker, in the words of Jerome Tang, another buzzword from him, we just tinker on this roster, we can be really good. We can take a step up in the Big 12 once the conference play goes from 20 games to 18 games this season. We can add a little bit more strength to our non-conference. We'll be a lot more prepared because we have continuity and culture and buy-in. We'll have a better non-conference record. And we won't shoot ourselves in the foot when we hit the new year, when we hit the back end of our Big 12 play, and our resume will look a lot better. And maybe we're not talking about being a bubble team, but being a surefire seeded team when it comes to the NCAA tournament. No news is good news, folks. That's exactly what I'm sticking with right now. But there is plenty of news when it comes to the Big 12 right now, when it comes to the transfer portal. There are multiple schools that are having a really tough time. And some of them were players that have certain ties to our head coach. So I want to talk about that now, next on Locked On Kansas State. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Well, between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it is easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So you just stop managing your money and start building wealth. When I first started using Monarch, I just realized how much I was spending on food delivery. Now I budget smarter and save more. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. And thank you for making Locked On Kansas State your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On College Basketball with Isaac Shade and Andy Patton. March is here. And be the most informed college basketball fan throughout the madness. Find Locked On College Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. We're digging into college basketball here, digging into the transfer portal, and there's not a lot of traction right now with Kansas State, but there is still a lot of, in my mind, optimism. Still a lot of concern and still a lot of questions. Some of those questions across the conference have been answered. And for some of these schools, it's not been great. And I like to have a conversation with Nick Marvitz. We have this all the time over on Locked On Cyclones. But Farmageddon, I mean, after them losing in the round of 32 to Ole Miss, Iowa State took a big hit. They lost 4 players in the transfer portal. Not a great time for them, losing that many players in the portal when their in-state rival, Iowa Hawkeyes, look like they're on the top of the world after getting Ben McCollum and Bennett Sturts. Instantly hate the Iowa Hawkeyes now for that, because I don't know if we ever even had a chance. We had that conversation in the last podcast. I don't think we did once Ben McCollum signed a a Power 4 coaching job, but nevertheless, we are looking at Iowa State having a tough time now. 4 players entering the transfer portal, including their star center, Deshaun Jackson, center. I mean, big player here. I'm guessing he's going to try and transfer to a pretty nice school, another Power 5 school, or Power 4 school, I guess you could say. Well, do you think Power 5 still in basketball? Do you consider Big East a Power 5 school? Let me know that in the comments. That's actually a big debate right now on social media I saw. So do you consider the Big East a power school in basketball? That's a fun one. But Iowa State having a tough time. And then you have Arizona State, who lost Josan Sanin, who's a great freshman guard. And he went to St. John's. He's going to go play for Patino, which could be a really interesting piece, another Big East team, if you will. But there could be some good news on the horizon for Arizona State. We'll find out actually today at 12:10 Eastern time. Pat McAfee's show on ESPN actually addressed this. He's going to break the news, or he's going to have it on his broadcast, of a 4-time Arizona high school state champion and 3-time Gatorade Player of the Year. His name is Koa Pete. He is a 6'8" player in the class of 2025. He's going to be announcing which college he will be hooping for next year. It's going to actually be on the Pat McAfee show on ESPN. Pretty interesting there. What I find interesting is that his final 5 here, 4 of them are the Big 12 schools, and then there's one former Big 12 school, Texas. But he also has Baylor, he has Houston, Arizona, and Arizona State. You got to think that maybe Arizona is out of it, because he's going to have the announcement the same day that the Wildcats have a Sweet 16 game. That's interesting, against the Duke Blue Devils, by the way, as well. So either he's trying to pump up his new school, or he's trying to maybe throw shade at him right away. We'll see what happens. If I had to put a guess out here, one, we're going to have to play him, because I don't think he's going to Texas. I mean, there's an 80% chance he stays in the Big 12. And if so, I'm going to lean, because he's been really good with recruits over the last couple of years, I'm going to lean Arizona State. Maybe our friend Richie Bradshaw will get lucky there. And then finally, out of the schools that have been having a tough time, I got to lean at Baylor here. Baylor's been struggling as well. Multiple players leaving the transfer portal. There's big question marks about, is Scott Drew doing enough, which I know probably tugs at the heartstrings of our coach, Jerome Tang. But multiple players are entering and leaving the transfer portal. One of those players is actually a player that was recruited by Jerome Tang when he was an assistant coach at Baylor. Redshirt junior, 6'4" junior, Langston Love. He's considered a shooting guard. He comes out of San Antonio, Texas, entered the transfer portal. And if you go to his on-3 record and you look at his recruiting path, if you will, it shows that when he was recruited, the main recruiter was Jerome Tang. So maybe that's something that is a possible tie to Kansas State. Maybe that's something that you could see him maybe approaching or coming in. That could be. He did enroll at Baylor in 2020. This is something that obviously happened a long time ago. But when you're recruited by a player, and Coach Tang has said this, especially when they played Baylor in the Big 12 Big 12 tournament, they talked about how he doesn't have many ties left, and he was focusing on Kansas State game, and that's it, not the Baylor ties. And he was doing what he should do as a coach when he was focused on the game, for sure. But one of the things he did mention was he only has a certain amount of ties left, very few, because he only recruited just a small amount of players. Well, now that gets even smaller at Baylor with one in the transfer portal. Could that mean maybe we see Langston Love with the Wildcats next year? Quite possible. I'm sure that there's a phone call being had. Maybe if you've recruited someone to Baylor, maybe you'll find a way to recruit him to Kansas State as well. Could be interesting. I mean, when he was the national 36, according to On3, the national player in the entire nation, 36 when he was recruited. He was the 8th shooting guard and the 8th player out of the state of Florida. ESPN actually had him as the 26th ranked player when he came out quite a few years ago. So that's where you have it with the Big 12. We're in a lot better shape than a lot of players, a lot of different programs in our conference. Now, there's going to be a little bit more probably transfer portal news when some of these other Big 12 schools leave. or leave the tournament, if you will, but maybe not. BYU has a great recruiting program right now. They just recruited one of the top players in the recruiting class that's coming in next year. We keep talking about the Houston model. We already know that retention's there, so you can probably assume they're not going to have anybody leave the portal. And then we'll see what happens with Texas Tech and Arizona. Texas Tech has not been afraid to spend money, though. So retooling doesn't seem like a problem for them. If Jerome Tang really believes in this core, which as of right now, no one's left in the portal. So meaning nobody's chose to leave or nobody has been asked to leave. If he really believes in this core and he has the collective or the donors to help him build and bring more players in, there is no reason why this team can get back into contention in the Big 12. There's no reason. Absolutely can do it. Only a few years away. Now, it's a completely different team, but only a few years removed from taking this team to the Elite Eight. Whether you believe that it was a different roster than his or not, Jerome Tang took that team to the Elite Eight, meaning he can do it again. So let's talk about all these rumblings, because there are a few expected exits. And unfortunately, there might be a little more than we might be thinking. So let's talk about that to finish up this show right here on Locked On Kansas State. We're all about the stats because numbers don't lie. And when it comes to the all-new Nissan Armada Pro 4X, the numbers are on an MVP level. With the ability to tow up to 8,500 pounds, it can quite literally carry the whole team, plus the gear, wherever you need to go. It's powered by a twin-turbo V6 engine, delivering the strength and performance to handle highways, back roads, and everything in between. And with room up for 8 people, the Armada Pro 4X is built for big crews, big adventures, and even bigger memories. Whether you're exploring off-road trails or rolling up to the arena, the Armada Pro 4X brings power, versatility, and style wherever you go. So take adventures to new heights in the all-new Nissan Armada Pro 4X. Learn more at nissanusa.com.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the bracket breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
Talking college basketball here, talking transfer portal, not talking much about it because there's not much going on. It's a good problem in my opinion, but I think that's about to change very soon. When? Not sure, but I do think we're going to have some news coming down the pipeline very soon for Kansas State, and we might get a better idea of what this team is looking for, what this team needs to add, and where they need to spend the money, the Coleman Hawkins money, if you will. And I think it's got to be a little bit more than that. I'm going to go ahead and throw that reminder one more time. There was a anonymous ACC coach that talked to On3 last week and said, in order to be a top 25 school next year, he believes that programs have to spend upward to $6 million this transfer portal cycle. Now, I do believe he means that as a roster whole. There's also some new news that came out about revenue sharing. We'll get into that in another episode as well, because we're going to dig deep in that one, because I do think that might be some trouble ahead for Kansas State and the Big 12. But there are some players that might be on their way out for the Wildcats, and we'll see what happens here. You know, I'm surprised. One of the names that I'm surprised that we didn't hear on that Monday is Buddy Rich. And I know that there are many people in my comments that always ask, whenever I do a live show, it's one of the comments we get every time. How come Buddy Rich didn't play? Or what do you thought about Buddy Rich when he had the opportunity to play? Because we've seen some really great things from McCaleb Buddy Rich. But there was some sort of relationship hiccup, maybe. Not sure exactly what went wrong with Buddy Rich, because Jerome Tang refused to talk about it. Went to a press conference and said, wasn't good. That's something that's not going to be said here, which in hindsight, I respect, because he's doing what a coach needs to do. And that was right in the midst of him trying to build the culture and the buy-in of the entire team. One hiccup could have changed this entire season and could have made it even worse than what we're feeling right now. There could have maybe been no possibility of a bubble if there was one more sever in that locker room. Who knows? Who knows how fragile that team might have been at one point. So I'm glad in hindsight that he didn't actually reach out and do that. But I do expect to maybe see his name in the portal just because of how that season was handled with him. I would love to see him back at Kansas State because I think he has great potential, and I think he could be a great asset and a great role player on next year's team. But I expect his name to be in the portal at some time before this closes. Ugana Unyesio, I think he's going to be in the portal as well, hearing some rumblings about him. And then also hearing some rumblings about Bailey Fall. So that one's an interesting one. I know that he was a piece that was brought in, was some NIL money that came in as well. Really didn't have any production. So maybe that's a potential him moving down a level to try and get some playing time. I think that might be the move for Fall. And then try his power level again, his power 4 level again. That would probably be the best bet since he wasn't getting playing time at Kansas State. So with that being said, if those happen, 5 out the door, if you include Hawkins and Gasson. And then you got to worry about what's next with Max Jones, obviously waiting on a waiver. Now, I have heard both sides of this story. I've heard that they feel pretty good about this waiver, but I've also heard that they don't expect it to happen. So I can't give you really an honest feeling of what's going to happen. And I'm also I'm also hearing that they're waiting on a waiver for Tyreek Smith as well. Now, he is the player that entered the portal and is a portal piece that we picked up just early in the cycle, happened during the season, coming over from Memphis. There's also a conversation that he is waiting on a waiver, and they don't know if that's going to happen. So even though they did let him commit, and I think he was enrolled in classes as well, they're still waiting on a waiver from him. So could be 7 down overall. 5 players that we expect to be on the team could be on their way out. Now, only 3 would be in the transfer portal, and then we'd have 4 who would be ultimately out of eligibility. I think the most interesting one here would probably be losing Max Jones just because of the production that we've seen. It would be nice to have him back. He did do the senior day just in case. I mean, at least he had that if he doesn't get a chance to play back for Kansas State. But just knowing that he could have an opportunity to make a bigger piece of production, even if it meant he didn't start. And I know he started most of the year this year, but if they find a way to retool and build better there, if he could come off the bench, I think that'd be even better for the team. He does want to come back if he has an option. We'll see. We didn't get a chance to really see Tyreek Smith, so I don't really know what we would get from him. Now, I've heard things about him in practice. I've heard some rumblings about how he looks good in practice and why that may actually be a reason why certain players might be hitting the portal. But if you don't get a waiver for him, then that's almost like a double-edged sword. You were losing multiple players based on that production. So we'll see what happens. That's what we are sitting at right now as we slowly head into the weekend and finish the first week of the college basketball spring portal. Again, I do think things are going to happen. Maybe we get a Friday news dump. If that happens, we'll get on here. We're going to bring you Kansas State Wildcat coverage every single day, and it means Saturdays and Sundays too if there's news to talk about. We will definitely be talking on the weekends when the college football season's here. Don't you worry. But when we're in this kind of a slower period as we are right now, maybe we'll only go 6 days a week. Maybe. Chick-fil-A's not open on Sundays. Maybe Locked On Kansas State will close its doors as well. We'll see what happens. But thank you so much for listening to this episode. Really appreciate it. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button. We are growing, folks. We are growing. You hitting that subscribe, you hitting that like, you leaving comments is helping that algorithm push out. If you're on YouTube, you can start seeing those views are starting to rise, and that's all because of you. And I appreciate it so much. You make this such an adventure and so much fun for me to sit in front of this camera and have this conversation with you every single day. All right, we'll see you back here tomorrow. Until then, please like the video, please subscribe. And this has been Locked On Kansas State.